I think we can get started. People will still be joining, but I think we will kick off this webinar now. So welcome everyone to those that have joined to the webinar, Stewarding Land, Preserving Soils. How can we create the conditions for the development of agroecology and restoration of land in Europe? My name is Sylvia Kay. I work at the Transnational Institute, which is an international research and advocacy institute based in Amsterdam, where I work on issues related to agrarian and environmental justice. And I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar today. This webinar will be recorded, so do please bear that in mind. So I will just take a few minutes just to introduce some short housekeeping rules and share a bit the structure of this webinar and why we organized it. So this webinar is organized by members of the Ruralization project, which gathers 18 organizations across Europe, focusing on issues of generational renewal and opportunity building in rural areas. And during this webinar, we will be hearing from some of the members of this project who will be sharing with us insights from a number of studies that they have produced looking into key land policy and land market dynamics in Europe. And they will be doing so in dialogue with a representative from the European Commission. And we are delighted to have with us today Mr. Bavo Peters. Mr. Peters is a policy officer in the soil team of the Directorate General for Environment of the European Commission, DG ENVI. And he's previously worked as a policy coordinator and international policy officer for the Flemish government. Mr. Peters will present how the Commission, or at least DG ENVI, is engaging on the issue of soils, following the launch that some of you may know about by the Commission of a roadmap on a new EU soil strategy, which also included an element of public consultation that recently wrapped up at the end of April of this year. And we also, some of you may have heard about this, and I'm sure Mr. Peters will also speak to this as well, the adoption on the 28th of April of this year of a resolution by the European Parliament on soil protection, which recommended a broad framework for action based on the urgent need to address issues around the safeguarding and sustainable management of our soils, particularly as they continue to be impacted by issues such as unsustainable agricultural and forestry practices, urban expansion, and climate change. So following on from Mr. Peters' presentation, I will call on our other panelists who will then appear on your screens from the Ruralization Consortium, and they will bring in additional inputs from their areas of work, which I hope will illuminate some of the linkages, some of the connecting the dots work we want to do with this webinar between issues of soil and broader trends around the future of land, agriculture, food, the environment, and climate action throughout Europe. And finally, after this, we do hope to leave some time for your questions. So if you do have questions or comments, do please write them in the chat. So there's a chat box in the bottom ribbon of your screen. And please, if you have a question for a specific individual, do also please direct your question to that person. So without further ado, I think I would now like to turn it over to Mr. Bavo Peters from DG ENVI for his presentation. He has a PowerPoint presentation. And it would be great, Mr. Peters, if you can tell us a little bit more about this roadmap that I just spoke about, why there is a need for urgent action on soils, what the main results were of this consultation process that the Commission launched, and also what some of the key policy levers and frameworks are that impact on this area of work. I know that this issue of soils, while perhaps tackled from the perspective of DG ENVI, also has many, many other policy linkages to other framework directives and other areas of work from the EU institutions. So Mr. Peters, you have 15 minutes, and I should just point out that we will be taking a few questions of clarification after your presentation. So if people just have points of clarification, do also please write those in the chat, and should they arise, we will take a few minutes after your presentation, keeping in mind that the main discussion will take place right at the end after all the panelists have spoken. So enough from my end, and Mr. Peters, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. and for the invitation. I'm Bavo Peters. I work in DG Environment in the soil team, and I will try to update you on the developments in EU soil policy. So first, let's start with a bit of history, because I think it's important to understand where we stand today. Today, the main EU soil policy instrument is still the non-binding soil thematic strategy that was adopted already 50 years ago. And therefore now it is a bit outdated. In the strategy, actions were grouped in 4 pillars, integrating soil protecting measures in national and EU policies and in other policy domains, adopting EU soil legislation, closing the knowledge gaps through the funding of research, and increasing public awareness on the need to protect soil. So in order to implement the legislative pillar of the soil strategy, back then in 2006, the strategy was accompanied by a proposal for a soil framework directive, so legally binding EU soil legislation. The Parliament quite quickly adopted a positive opinion in first reading, but in the Council, the proposal was blocked for 8 years, and it was blocked by 5 member states. You see their flags here. And this was mainly on the grounds of subsidiarity, fear of the cost of remediation of contaminated sites, and also pressure from the agricultural lobby. So after 8 years of discussion in the Council, unfortunately, the Commission was forced to withdraw the proposal in 2014. Now, the fact that there isn't a soil directive specifically dedicated to soil protection doesn't mean that the problem is not addressed at all at EU level. Soil protection is addressed in several strategies, directives, legislation, policy instruments, etc. And you see an overview here. But there is no binding soil instrument with an integrated vision that can coordinate all these policies. Soil protection is often an outcome, a beneficial outcome of the protection of other environmental resources such as air, water, or from addressing other environmental problems or threats. So for the moment, there are no common EU definitions, no common binding targets on soil, or no common thresholds to define what good or bad soil quality could be. Also at global level, a lot of things are happening. Specifically relevant are the Rio conventions, the UNCCD, which is a UN convention specifically dedicated to desertification and land degradation. There is the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is particularly relevant when it comes down to soil biodiversity. There is, of course, the best known UN convention, the Climate Convention, and this is relevant because of the link between soil and climate change and the role of soil as a sink or an emitter of carbon. Then in 2015, there was the adoption of the Agenda for Sustainable Development, specifically relevant because there is a target to achieve to strive to achieve land degradation neutral world by 2030, and the EU is a party and also therefore subscribed this target. Other relevant platform is the Global Soil Partnership. And then there are the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, particularly the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants is quite influential and relevant. And what happens at global level has a direct impact on EU policy, because the commitments made at global level have to be translated in EU policy. So over the last years, there is increasing pressure to act. Many influential reports and studies came out, and basically they all say the same. Land degradation is everywhere. Urgent action is needed. And the longer we wait, the more difficult and costly also it will become to restore. The last report there you see is an audit by the European Court of Auditors that looked into the problem and concluded that the risk of desertification and land degradation is currently not being well addressed at EU level. And they made a couple of recommendations to the Commission to improve the situation. Then every 5 years, there's also the State and Outlook of the Environment report by the European Environment Agency. And as maybe you cannot read it well, but for soil and land use, all traffic lights are currently on red. And this is the only problems where all traffic lights are on red are for climate change and for the loss of biodiversity. And here is a more detailed assessment of the EEA. And basically, they are saying that the problem will continue in the future, is likely to deteriorate because the drivers will not change favorably. They also say that better monitoring is needed at EU level, that there is a lack of binding targets, and that the EU is risking not to meet international and European commitments. As said, the Parliament is also increasing the political pressure since they adopted a resolution on soil protection last month. And it was with a big majority, so this even increases the weight. And in the resolution, the Parliament does a lot of concrete policy proposals and also calls for an EU legal framework for soils, meaning EU legislation on soil. So here you see the structure of the European Green Deal that was first announced end of 2019. It was a clear difference in terms of priorities with the previous Commission, I think, with the Juncker Commission, because President von der Leyen, it was her first big initiative, and it was on climate and environment. Many of the Green Deal objectives depend on healthy soils, climate neutrality, loss of biodiversity, zero pollution, food security, etc. And the European Green Deal, announced in December 2019, was then the starting point for many new initiatives, and it set the overarching political vision and priorities. So here you see a bit the mandate that we're currently operating in. So it goes step by step. The Green Deal communication announced a biodiversity strategy for 2030. This biodiversity strategy was adopted in May 2020, and then that strategy announced that the Commission would update the old soil strategy. So it works a bit like a waterfall or a cascade. And now we come to a couple of relevant policy initiatives. The Green Deal announced the Zero Pollution Action Plan for Air, Water and Soil. This action plan was adopted last month on 12th May. It's a cross-sectoral and integrated strategy on pollution, so air, water and soil. Such an approach is new, but it's also necessary to address the full chain of pollution from source to the end of the pipe in its totality. The action plan contained several actions on soil pollution, and the common denominator between the Zero Pollution Action Plan and the soil strategy is soil pollution. But the EU soil strategy will be much broader and covers all threats for soil quality, such as erosion, sealing, land take, etc. So in 21, so this year, probably after summer, somewhere, the Commission will update the old soil strategy. And to be clear, we start from a blank page, so not from the text from the previous strategy. It will again be a communication from the Commission that announces several actions. A communication is non-binding, and this time there will be no accompanying legal proposal. There was also a public consultation for 12 weeks. Closed on 27th of April. We received more than 1,600 replies, mostly from individual citizens, followed by academia and by representatives from companies. Most replies came from Italy, followed by Germany and France. Protecting soil quality at EU level was considered very important by 93% of the respondents. So this gives a clear mandate to work on soil at EU level. Land take and sealing were considered as the most important threats to address. So currently we're drafting the text of the strategy in full consultation with other DGs and Commission services, so it's not only an environment initiative. And we plan to adopt, as said, after summer, somewhere probably in September or October. The biodiversity strategy also announced that the Commission would come with a proposal for legally binding EU nature restoration targets. Ecosystems and ecosystem degradation is a much broader concept, of course, than only soils and soil degradation, but we consider soil as an ecosystem in its own right that is cross-cutting and that underpins all other terrestrial ecosystems. And therefore, we are currently investigating how soil restoration could be included and addressed under this initiative, but this is still very much work in progress and under discussion. And then the last point is the Horizon Europe mission on soil health and food. Soil health is one of the 5 topics of the so-called Horizon missions, and this approach concentrates a significant amount of research funding on a limited number of societal problems. And the fact that soil is one of the 5 missions shows that it is currently higher on the policy agenda, because the other missions are on also important societal problems: climate change, cancer, ocean pollution, and greener cities. So this mission will hopefully make a lot of funding available for soil research. So that was it from my side. Thank you for your attention and happy to try to answer your questions if there would be questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Bavo. I think that was a really great overview, and thank you also for bringing in the longer historical perspective. You know how long this issue of soils has been on the radar, and attempts to get sort of legislation moving, and how it's also embedded within both different EU policy processes and also international global level policy processes, which reflect then again on Europe. So thank you for that overview. And also I was reminded when you said about the traffic signals all being on red, these kind of alarm bells ringing. I was just looking again at the European Parliament's resolution on soil protection, and just to share a few figures with the audience here, like about how urgent action is needed and how trends are going in the wrong direction. In the EU Parliament's resolution, it was mentioned that about 60 to 70% of EU soils are unhealthy due to the current management practices. Yeah, and that there's a huge threat also of erosion and salinization, particularly around the sort of Southern Europe, Southern Mediterranean countries. So those are some of the real risks that we are facing at the moment. So that kind of underscores also the need for action on this front. I don't see any points of clarification at this particular moment. So I take that your presentation was very clear. So I think then perhaps we will switch to the panel component of this webinar. So for this, I would like to ask my fellow panelists, Attila Schuch, Willem Korthaus-Altes, and Clara Blasco Moreno to join me. Feel free to switch on your cameras at this particular moment. So I'll briefly introduce them before moderating the panel discussion. So we are joined by, as I mentioned, Attila Schuch. He is a peasant farmer from Transylvania, Romania, where since a few years he is running a small family farm rooted in the principles of peasant agroecology. He's also a member of the Coordination Committee and former president of Eco-Ruralis, which is a Romanian peasants network, where he also oversees their land rights program. And he's also a Coordination Committee member of the European Coordination Via Campesina, the European Peasant Farmers Confederation. So welcome, Attila. We then also have Professor Willem Korthaus-Altes. He is a professor in land development at Delft University of Technology here in the Netherlands. He's been active in the fields of research on land development and land planning, and has published widely in peer-reviewed journals. So welcome, Willem. And then finally also we are joined by Clara Blasco Moreno. She is a project officer at the Nature Conservation Network, known as XCN by its Catalan acronym. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Catalan or in Spanish. But her work focuses on the intersection between rural development and nature conservation. And she's volunteered in different European countries within organic farming and forest management initiatives. And prior to XCN, the Nature Conservation Network, she worked in areas of food waste prevention and environmental education. So welcome to all my panelists. I know that you've all been involved in some key studies on land and farming in Europe. And so what I wanted to do with you is explore a bit this connection between soil protection, land use, and land rights. And more broadly, of course, food, agriculture, and climate. So perhaps, Attila, I thought I would direct the first question to you. Given that I know you've been involved in a report produced by the Land Strategies Partnership, which is another European network composed of peasant organizations, land trusts, and consumer organizations. And this report was called Roots of Resilience, Land Policy for an Agroecological Transition in Europe. And one of the key arguments of the report was that sustainable land use, and so by extension also sustainable soil management, correlates or tracks also with who owns and controls land, and also what the particular vision of land is that underpins the choice of farming in a particular way, a particular farming style, and a particular farming approach. So given this, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you see land use, land rights, and land protection issues interacting, and also how these kind of crucial questions, basic but critical questions about land for whom and land for what, how do they sort of play into this debate between land and soil protection?
Thank you, Sylvia. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you, Mr. Peters, for the interesting outline and approach of the Commission. It was very interesting to hear about the process. So indeed, as Sylvia, as you ask, I wanted to highlight an angle that is intimately connected with the soil issue, which is the aspect of land governance. So the right and access to land have major social, environmental, and economic impacts across Europe, as we already witnessed. And one of the key underlying factors in the wider agricultural debate, land policy is critical for the understanding and shaping of the future of European farming. And in particular, in Europe, if Europe wants to implement the systematic changes that it set out in the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. So what I believe and we believe is that stewardship and use of land play a key role also in soil fertility and also employment on a social level, but also the biological and social vitality of the rural areas. Nevertheless, despite the evident synergies with the climate and social goals of the European Union, and we've seen some of the synergies and debates on the soil, ensuring access to land for small-scale and peasant farming and communities and also other minority groups is often overlooked, though they are the majority of the European farmers, no? And the ones that practice peasant agroecology, which is a practice that is constantly safeguarding and revitalizing soils. So just to paraphrase a little bit what Mr. Peters was saying is that indeed here too, the traffic lights seem to be all red when it comes to this debate. Crucial questions arise then, as you say, Sylvia. So who controls land and how is that land used? And is land stewarded properly? And who does it benefit? So we see this, and in a report, we underline numerous complex and interconnected issues that threaten access to sufficient land, especially to earn a dignified livelihood in diverse regional contexts, and also to preserve lands in this process. So I want to bring for a very crucial problem that is connected to land. For example, little has been done on a European level to crack down on speculative land acquisitions in the EU and to stop land concentration and the phenomenon of land grabbing. Though I can also tell it from my experience as a farmer and land activist from Eastern Europe that I witness often how large multinational investment funds and large banks and non-farming institutions, many of them financial institutions, together with other industrial farming enterprises, create extreme land concentration. And if we look at the European level, we see that the land concentration in Europe is huge. So although the majority of European farmers are family farmers and small-scale, mid-scale farmers, much of the land, a very big percentage, is in the hand of large industrial farms. So it's a very, very critical issue to tackle. Also, the issue of land grabbing, that is this sort of illegal and corrupt way to take over land and control over land, is also a huge problem. And also this kind of like treating this sheer power of circumventing national laws only to speculate with the land's price. And this has a direct impact also over, well, not just the quality of the rural countryside, but also the quality of the soils. Besides the alienation of peasant farming and other communities from these lands, one other important violation is towards the soil in forms of intensive depletion of the biological resources and mismanagement of our crucial resource. And I just want to say that in many Central and Eastern European countries, extreme land concentration also coexist, as we know, with extreme land fragmentation. And I know others from the speakers will talk more about this dualistical agrarian structure. But I just would like to say that one of the policy issues is also because land is not tackled on a central level in the European Union, and many governments, especially from the Eastern and Central European countries, are engaging into more, let's say, populist or nationalistic approaches when it comes to land policies. And through this, they get into clinches with the European community and the European Commission. So it's much important, as you also highlighted our report, The Roots of Resilience, that we jointly put forward as a consortium of peasant movement, of civil society and consumer organizations, that we bring a lot of valid proposals in that report on all levels of governance. And I would like to mention them later, maybe, because now I would like to rather engage in a discussion. So, but just to finalize with a few other thoughts, we need to link also the land rights problem with the aging population of farmers. That means that millions of hectares of land in Europe will change hands in the coming 2 decades. We see this as a huge issue. So what happens to that land and when it reaches the market is key. The step taken right now by policymakers to safeguard land and soils will dictate whether the transitional period will fuel farmland concentration and intensive farming and the depletion of soils, or will enable the entry of a new generation of organic and agroecological sustainable farmers. So it's a very important parallel to be made. So we clearly state that it is high time to rediscover the roots of our resilience, as the report says, by grounding our land policies in collective action and democratic forms of land politics. So this is exactly what we are promoting in the Nyéléni Europe and Central Asia Food Sovereignty Network that many of the writers of the report are part of. And just want to highlight one final aspect that it's important, and for us, as peasant farmers and civil society organizations writing that report, land is not just a sheer commodity. It's not an asset to be transacted. It's much more than that. It's a common resource. It's a living territory. It's a natural landscape. So as farmers and as peasant farmers, we have a deep and abiding relationship with land that is based on caretaking and appreciation of that land. And we appreciate that land is held in trust for now and for the future generation. So we name ourselves, and we indeed are the stewards of the land, which is a very important element of soil also, how to steward soil and the land on which it sits. So many times we find ourselves also to be the guardians of this land, and there are a lot of struggles on the ground that we also highlight in the report. So there are a lot of struggles coming from, for instance, to save the fertile soils of Rocha Montana against an extractive mining corporation, or from Spain, from Somonte and from Marinaleda, or the Notre-Dame-de-Land from France is a very interesting and important struggle that was going on, where we as committed farmers and citizens root our collective action in the right of people to define their own food system and agricultural system. And it's very important that we define how we feed ourselves and to continue to nurture the soil that feeds us. We call this food sovereignty, and I would like to end with this concept that we put forward in the Roots of Resilience report, that the food sovereignty is the common grounds of our experiences. So I'm very open to have now to listen to my fellow speakers and then to engage later in the debate. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Attila, and thanks for also grounding our discussion in those kind of fundamental values, you know, of soil and land not just being kind of key resources for production and for economic value, but also tracking with many other kinds of cultural, social, and democratic principles, you know, as I think you've really brought in that notion. And I underline this concept of land stewardship that you brought in, that, you know, this kind of caretaking approach, and that, you know, key questions about decision-making over land, you know, also determines issues of models of farming, land use, and also bringing in this kind of future-orientated perspective with this new entrants and generational turnover. So I hope we will circle back, I think, to many of those issues that we raised and come back to them. So thanks for that. Perhaps then turning to Professor Kortels-Altert, Willem, if I may. I know that you've also been producing a number of studies within the Ruralization project. Particularly, you did an in-depth kind of study looking at broad trends across kind of land markets and land holdings across various EU member states. And I know that you selected, on the basis of that, you highlighted some key threats, some sort of commonalities when it comes to challenges around land preservation and also soil management. So I was wondering if you could share a bit some of the synthesis of that analysis with us.
Sylvia, again, I also want to raise, with this report, I will go into that, and I will have done a report with colleagues, of course, on the national arrangements and policies and laws on land. And one of the questions we asked there to national reporters, and they discussed it, is it easy for public and private entities to change farmlands into an urban development areas? And we have asked it to 28 national reporters, and almost all said yes. And they indicated different reasons, but this idea of that this land take based for urban development is considered by those national reporters, and we asked them based on expertise. They usually say yes, that is relatively easy. So it's good to take this in mind if you look at policies. This other report was on land market, land holdings and trends into it. And we've also made use of the analysis, different kind of sources. One of the sources we also look about the land cover data of the European Agency, Environmental Agency. And there they have made certain analysis and also on sprawl. And you have between 2000 and 2018, 1.4 million hectares of sprawl has been there within the EU. And it's relevant to note, and that's maybe not that everyone had expected, only 22% of it is urban sprawl, but the other 78% is sprawl of economic size and infrastructure. And quite often the government is very well involved in infrastructure, certainly, but also in economic size, new business parks, new development, airports, all kinds of elements in which the government is involved. So if you want to reduce land take, government policies are very important. I mean, you don't focus only on this urban sprawl part, which is 22%, it's relevant, but in the majority are those other elements of this economic science and infrastructure. If you look at further kind, because this information is available, of course, in all kinds of forms, but also we have looked at the NUTS 3 level, you see that there are also differences within member states, within regions, but also within different types of regions within the same member state. So you see that there are certain member states in which those policies to take economic sites and infrastructure is larger than others. So this is something you can do. It's not something naturally given, but there are some policies which makes it relevant. So there is something here in relation to the protection of the soils where you can do something. May I put also on the debate on Attila, which we also looked at the unequalness of land ownership in different regions. And then you can see, especially in those more remote regions, there is very uneven. There's differences between regions, and certain regions is very uneven, where most land is held by only a few landholders, and most farmers, peasants in that case, own a few lands. And then you see here a development, and in general you see the development, if you look at over years, that the unevenness stays the same, but it happens the way that in most regions, some regions not, because the small farmers go and the large farmers grow, and then you say it's still uneven, but on both sides it goes to this scale enlargement, and many of the scale enlargements I learned many times it's mostly not very good for the soil. So that's a thing which is relevant. I can pick some more elements out of it, but leave it here for this moment, or do you want to have more outcomes?
I think we can certainly in a discussion part and Q&A like bring in some more elements, but I think you've already introduced some crucial elements. I mean, and actually that figure that you mentioned I think is very interesting. I didn't know this, that when it comes to this issue of sprawl and kind of soil sealing and agricultural land being lost, essentially converted to other uses, Yeah, I think urbanization and urban sprawl is always on people's minds, but it's very interesting, this figure that you mentioned, that just 22% is from urban expansion, or that you found in your study, and 78% from kind of infrastructure and kind of economic development initiatives. So I think, yeah, I'm really taking away that figure that you introduced to the debate. So I'm sure we can also come back around to that. Yeah, then, I mean, I'll now turn to Clara. I mean, you work for a nature conservation network, and quite often farming in some conservation circles, not all, certainly not all, I should say, is seen very much as kind of a threat or an enemy even, and it can get quite polarized when it comes to debates between nature conservation and farming. So I was very curious to hear from your perspective, how do you see nature conservation, biodiversity protection, how do those link with issues of farming and agriculture from your perspective?
Sure, thanks, Sylvia. This is a really key important questions because it is important for us as a naturalist or conservationist to work together with the farming sector, because we believe that we can follow common goals. So farming can indeed be one of the causes for soil degradation or for nature degradation, but farming can also represent a strategy to restore and preserve soil and other natural resources or values. So of course, whether farming is destructive or regenerative, that will depend on which practices are being implemented and the specific social environmental context. But for instance, I would like to introduce a few selected findings from the Ruralization report on land innovations, because those can illustrate the potential of farming in achieving soil conservation goals or other broader environmental goals. So this recent report studies innovations, social innovations, to provide access to land for agroecological projects, and also to provide access to land for new entrants in agriculture. So these innovations offer alternatives to land control by agroindustry and large intensive farms. So such innovations foster a necessary agroecological transition, because they provide different means of production, different logics, different parameters, not only in the environmental terms, but also in social ones. So it is important to highlight that these innovations are can offer best practices and foster this kind of transition. So this report highlights these alternatives, but it also highlights that there's no fundamental contradiction or opposition between farming and soil health. There's a potential contradiction, but it's not a fundamental one. And the report illustrates it by means of different land innovation practices. And I will just elaborate on two of them, and we can later discuss on others if you wish to. But for instance, I would like to highlight an example from Romania, developed by the ADAPT Foundation in the Transylvania region. So this foundation has helped preserve over 30,000 hectares of farm and natural land as well, by advising and accompanying farmers to adopt practices and management measures to achieve specific environmental and nature conservation goals. Some of the incentives that were used were in the framework of agro-environmental measures of the Common Agricultural Policy. And those included remunerating farmers for the environmental work or role that they were developing. Incentives included creation of local brands, but also support for marketing, diversification schemes, or on-ground management measures of the farmland as well. Another example of such social land innovations that are in line with nature conservation goals would be an iris example. This is at a different scale. It is developed by the iris cultivation renewal program. And this project specifically focus on rehabilitating and bringing either abandoned land back into cultivation through regenerative agriculture and development and use of ancient crop varieties, and also with this component of cultural values. So the organic farming methods promoted by this program include introducing this crop, and include using green manure and other techniques that are directly impacting positively in the soil health. So there are other examples within this report that I believe Alice has linked it. We can discuss about different innovations later. In the report, we include 64 of different countries, European ones. Those practices are really diverse, but they prove that farming and sound land management can go hand in hand. There's a clear potential there. These innovations also show that we can raise awareness and broaden the community of citizens, of people concerned with promoting sustainable agriculture. And also specifically, if we wish to, they can be used to engage the community in preventing or reverting land abandonment and fighting land sealing, depending on the context we are talking about. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think that there's a clear potential of common goals, and we should work on that line, and fostering this type of initiatives, or this type of social land innovations can and should be a key lever in restoring and preserving soils in Europe. That's it for now. Yeah.
No, thanks, and thanks for putting the emphasis also on the opportunities that are there to be grasped, and the positive, alternatives, and the good practices. And I think your study, which you mentioned, has inventorized 64 different kind of social innovations, or land policy innovations, or land use innovations. Really speaks to the wealth of some good practices that are going on. And that therefore we can't also be homogenizing. Either farming bad and nature conservation good. This is very much a question of as you said, highlighting destructive versus regenerative practices. I thought that was also a good way of framing things that you introduced. So thank you for that. So I wanted to switch now a little bit to another to a sort of second part of the panel, and another round of interventions, really looking a bit more at the different policy making levels. I know within the EU, we always talk about kind of local or regional or territorial or national or supranational kind of policy making levels. And I wanted to explore a little bit with the three of you how these different policy making levels, how they may complement or contradict one another. And particularly where some of also the opportunities are that we can grasp when it comes to protecting land and soils. So I thought for this question, for this round rather, to start with Willem, because I know that within the Ruralization project, again, you've really looked at different member states, sort of 27 EU member states and the UK, looking at sort of different opportunities within their national land policy frameworks for how land can be used sustainably. And you, in your previous intervention, really put a lot of emphasis on the kind of nuances also even within member states and different regions within that. So perhaps can you elaborate then a little bit on this kind of national dimension and where you see some of the main gaps perhaps in national policy frameworks and the main opportunities when it comes to soil protection?
We looked foremost at the land law, so how leases are organized and that kind of thing, and that is of course part of national policies. At the relation of the question of the protection of farmland, because it was related on farmland more than on forestry, and of course forests are a very important part of the soil. It's saying that in many in only few countries there are specific agricultural land protection policies there, and even if they are so, in some cases they are more we have it, but it's not so important anymore. Mostly things are based on say, the land use planning matters, in which is quite often at a more decentral level, and there is not so much at the national level. So here you can see that the questions are that at regional authorities or local authorities that play a main role in here, and the national government provide laws and legislations, and there, yeah, this is there, and it's not, but it's not very strong based on what these experts indicate. So it's not, yeah, it's not that you can say we can do a lot more, I think. But also it's relevant that we also seen that the governments have a high diversity in, say, also the quality of government. How much trustworthiness are there? How much citizens perceive that they are fair, that everyone is equal under the law by the governments? I mean, there have been the Quality of Government Institute does every now and then a kind of big survey, and then you can see that in certain regions, people experience that government is not doing a very good job. So they are, that's different, and that's very relevant if you have a problem, if you have, as Attila says, we have very strong economic powers, and based on our studies, it's often they are very much related also towards political powers, economic powers. They work together in a way that, yeah, as a simple landowner or land user, you are no big party in that. So that is also relevant, that you do not have to say that governments organize everywhere in the same way and everywhere provides a same level of fairness to everyone in it. And that's also more a relevant issue, what is also head of all kinds of political agendas, but it's very complex to address it.
Yeah, I can imagine the intersection between political and economic power is is a very complex and tough issue to get into. Perhaps we can pick some of this up in the discussion and Q&A part of the webinar. Yeah, and I would then encourage people that if you do have questions and if you do have or comments even, please do write those in the chat so we can pick them up in the following section when we turn to that. Inevitably, when we talk about EU level policy making and big frameworks that impact on land and agriculture and food and farming, we can't avoid talking about CAP, the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. I know that there's a lot to be said here, and CAP reform negotiations are ongoing, although we have many indications around things like eco schemes and things where some of those indicators or criteria may be heading. But I will perhaps, and I know it's a big question, but I will perhaps pose this to you, Clara, about how do you see CAP, the CAP piece really fitting into this? How do you think CAP can be really used as a tool to incentivize soil protection? Is it all bad news, or are there some good glimmers of hope that you see as positive?
Well, as CAP being a tool to incentivize soil protection, indeed there's a huge potential there. I think this is not a question, but then how we articulate this potential is the big issue. So just to link with the land innovations that we were mentioning, of course, both the agro-environmental measures and eco schemes are instruments that can be used by member states to provide incentives to farmers. And this is happening with more or less success, depending on the measure and on the country. And as we have seen, there are some land innovations that we studied that use some CAP agro-environmental measures as a levers for rural regeneration. Yet, more socio-environmental criteria must be used in the process of designing such tools, both in terms of impacting, so conservation effectiveness, but also in terms of how many hectares and how many farmers do apply for such measures. We can come into that later, because I believe that, well, and it is evident that CAP is much more than these measures and these eco schemes. And there are some fundamental aspects that are more important, both in terms of budget and in terms of potential impact. that must be addressed before even that these agro-environmental measures and eco schemes. And as it was mentioned in the first session, it is important to integrate the soil strategy into other policies. So clearly CAP would be one of these. So for instance, some literature show that and demonstrates that the management practices that stem in the context of the CAP have reduced the soil loss rate by 20%. The soil loss rate in arable lands caused by water erosion. So indeed, there's a clear positive impact potentially on the CAP. Yet, as it has been illustrated by other speakers, more needs to be done to protect soil, and amongst others, we must do it through the CAP. But at first, I would like to highlight a very important limitation of the current of this current policy, and it is how the payments are made. So the structure of the CAP has long been dominated by uniform payments based on the farm size or the number of livestock or historical rights. However, there's literature that shows that uniform payments are the least effective approach in terms of nature conservation or soil conservation, if this is what we talk about today. Yet, under the World Trade Organization framework, there's this agriculture agreement that does allow payments for environmental services, such as soil preservation, that could be. But this is something that is not being properly developed, at least in the country I live in. As the environmental and biodiversity are public goods, a greener CAP would require payments to be uncoupled from production and instead linked to environmental objectives. This could improve the cost effectiveness and increase the likelihood of reaching soil conservation goals or other environmental goals. But this is a current CAP limitation, and this is not changing somehow in this reform. It is a fundamental aspect that is not being challenged. And this is one of the reasons why agro-environmental measures in Spain, at least, are not being successful. So the logic behind must be changed so that agroecological farms are the ones acknowledged and remunerated for the public goods that they provide. But since this big issue of payments is not actually being changed, there's nothing we can debate further, maybe, or maybe later. But if we wonder how CAP can be a tool nowadays in the tools that are available or that are likely to be available, then it is evident that the instruments in the first pillar are the most powerful mechanisms to do so. Hence, the effort should be invested on that line. So ensuring that the national strategic plans adopt the strictest possible capping and redistribute the subsidies in favor of sustainable farming. So more thoroughness in the definition and compliance of the conditionality, and it is also necessary to accordingly calculate the basic payment, adjusting it to the value of the public good provided. And this is something really tricky, but really fundamental. And another clear demand that we could highlight when considering how CAP can contribute to soil restoration or soil preservation, it is a really clear one, is to exclude all subsidies that go against soil conservation goals. It sounds really obvious, but this is a reality now, at least in Spain. For instance, investments for farming modernization should be channeled towards agroecological transition, not towards the intensification of productive models that exceed the capacity of our ecosystems. But that happens. There's investment on industrial livestock, or there's investment on intensive pig farming, and there's investment on transformation to intensive irrigation systems. And all these examples have a tremendous impact on soil resources. So in a nutshell, in order for CAP to incentivize soil protection, these fundamental aspects should be addressed. conditionalities, subsidies distribution, acknowledgement of public goods, and excluding contradictory subsidies. This could be summarized with more or less aligning the CAP genuinely with the farm to fork strategy and with the biodiversity strategy. Also, I would like to elaborate further on the link with land innovations and maybe with some specificities regarding eco schemes, because indeed it is an instrument that may have a lot of potential, but I think that maybe we can tackle that in the questions and answers, because maybe I will go too much into detail now.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it's a tough question to answer in just a few minutes, but I think you've put your finger on some of the tensions and some contentious issues, you know, that are at the heart of the CAP debate, and some of these non-alignments maybe between the goals and objectives of CAP, or at least how those goals and objectives are being translated into actual schemes and policies, and things like the European Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy. You know, I'm not sure those synergies are always explicitly there, you know, and particularly when it comes to rewarding, as you say, really true agri-environmental innovations, you know, issues around public goods and conditionalities, particularly related to social and environmental standards, you know. So yeah, I think you've put a lot of food for thought there. We're coming to a close of this final round before we really get to the discussion, but with the audience. But I would just like to return, Attila, remember we started off at the beginning a bit by discussing a bit, you know, is there a need for a kind of European approach when it comes to also the issue of land? You know, we've talked about a European approach when it comes to the issue of soil with the roadmap by the Commission, and also a proposal by the European Parliament. In their resolution, they actually explicitly also call on the Commission for creating a kind of common legal framework for soil protection, soil management at the EU-wide level, and related to that also a creation of a sort of soil observatory or soil monitoring tool. And it reminded me very much of some of the recommendations in the Roots of Resilience report, where we also recommended the creation of perhaps an EU framework directive on land, an EU land observatory. So I'm curious how you see those two things, those two proposals really. How do they relate to one another, and how could they potentially unfold in coming years?
Indeed, very good that you mentioned that, because indeed in the Roots of Resilience report, but also through our general struggles from the grassroots and our collective initiatives, and some of them were enumerated, we highlight that a different set of land property relationships, but also a more diverse model of food production is needed for Europe. And that's clear also for what I understand from other speakers. So through this policy report, we pointed out that authorities, both on all levels, basically on local, on national and international level and competence, they shape land use and land ownership and land management. So they must support a future for diverse, sustainable agriculture in Europe. So this could contribute to the livelihoods of millions of small-scale food producers that practice agroecology and that safeguard soil. And we argue that policies need to sustain, in general, this more ecologically regenerative model of food production. I was mentioning peasant agroecology as a very good model to follow. And what we see now from a European perspective, the addressing of the land issues implies challenging the current status quo. And we see the status quo is the Europe's approach on the land issues, as also highlighted by Willem, is mostly technical and market-based. And it enshrines somehow, to some sort of speaking, the private property rights. So it finds its origins in the fundamental freedoms of the EU treaties, no? And in which land is considered merely a commodity. a transactionable asset. So it falls under the free movement of capital and within the common market. So this is a huge problem because we all know that land and the soil it bears is not just a transactionable asset. It's much more for us communities and farming communities and for food production and soil preservation. So we must support the development of a new framework for European land governance in order to bring more coherence, because although on a European level we see somehow that the land debate is much more pushed toward the national side, we do see that indirectly Europe has a lot of competence on land. Now we were talking about the effects of the cap, we were talking about the free movement of capital and so on. So on a European level we should address, and we have to address, the issue of land, possibly also following a pattern like it was mentioned, the tryout with the European Soil Directive. On the same basis we could also try out, let's say, a directive on land for Europe that would elevate best practices that exist currently in the member state level, but also would draw from this regional expertise to be found and to be interpreted by international standards. And I would mention here very important two standards and two guidelines, the FAO 10-year guideline that was developed and which European countries were signatory and they need to adopt in their legislation, and a Europe-wide legislation too. And also this recently adopted declaration, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in the rural areas. It's also a very important tool to be implemented also on a European level, which has specific articles on land and conservation of soil and so on. So we recommend also, indeed, as you mentioned, the observatory. There, I was mentioning and others were mentioning, there's a lot of untransparency over the land issue on the land markets and who owns land and who controls land and what effects does it have. So we also recommend through the report the creation of a European Land Observatory. So this could be a public institution that gathers robust, harmonized, and legitimate land tenure data, so we don't depend on third-party data, that include information on land use and include information on sales and rental prices, but also to have a high-level task force of permanent civil dialogue, which could be an initiative between the DG Agri basically and the other DGs and the representative of peasant organizations, CSOs, and affected communities, grassroots communities in general, because this could be an independent and comprehensive assessment of the impact of land related policies in the, to inform future policy making. So we did give these recommendations at a new level, and we realized that they're very transformative and they require a lot of innovation, something that Europe is engaging into, innovation on all levels. So why not innovate like this also land use and the way we look at land? But we also address the cap in this report. And it's good that you mentioned, Clara, the cap, because indeed, and I saw in the comments too, and I very much agree that until the basic payments are like this and are not redirected towards to prioritize small-scale farms, medium-sized farms, diverse farms, human-scale farming, young farmers, and new entrants, this is something that would maintain the status quo. So until the bulk of the support goes to large farming and concentration of land, we cannot expect as business as usual and the better conservation of soil also. So our report also outlines several important recommendations with regards to the cap. And I might realize now that after the recent witnessing of the trialogues, some of these discussions might be a bit late, but it's still, as Clara mentions in the national strategy plans, now it's ultimately important to include a lot of these support elements and a lot of this reshaping of these policies. So not just for the cap's sake, but also to create a coherent cross-policy dimension between the CAP, the Green Deal, and the Farm to Fork strategy. So yeah, it's a lot still on the table, but also we need to recognize that some of the very good transformative proposals unfortunately have not been taken in consideration. So just to finish up with the report and a little bit of the outlines, we did also bring recommendations on other two levels, on the national level too, but also on a regional and local level, because land policy has to be addressed on all these levels because of the different kind of policy making and policy enforcement in different countries and regions of Europe. So we did highlight some very interesting positive elements, like for instance the Scottish Land Reform Act, which is a very wonderful experience on how land land can be rethought on a national regional level. So it's something to be considered also and to be put as a good practice, but also to increase protection for tenants, because indeed, as Willem was mentioning, it is a lot of reality also that in Western European countries, tenants need more protection so that they can invest on their farms, also when it comes to biodiversity and soil conservation. So these are some of the recommendations, and just to mention a few of the local recommendations. Indeed, there are a lot of initiatives have been highlighted through the Ruralization project and are continuously highlighted of land innovations, as we call them. So this is anything from setting up land banks, land trusts, community stewardship of land. These are very important elements that need to be brought on the local regional debate when it comes to land planning and land management. Also, when local governments engage into inclusive spatial planning, it's also a place there to think of the soil dimension, of the land justice dimension. It's a very important, and how land is being conversed, and as Willem was mentioning, this kind of like net land intake and how land is being artificialized in many of our countries and regions. So these are important elements that need to be taken in consideration. I'm sorry that I did not manage to encapsulate all the proposals that were put in the Roots of Resilience work. That was quite innovative, but you can find it also, and I saw that it was shared on the chat. So I will stop here maybe, and based on all these elements, it would be wonderful to have a discussion. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, no, and so I think we will now move to the discussion elements, and I will at the very end also turn back to Bavo Peters to also explain a bit about the future direction of the roadmap and the Commission's work on soil protection, and how also all of us can potentially get further engaged on that issue. But I would also invite now Bavo to join in the debate. So feel free, Bavo, to put on your camera once again. I was just monitoring myself a bit, the chat. So I was sort of looking what some of the questions are that are coming up. And I see a few areas that we can discuss. Actually, I mean, I think it would be very interesting, Bavo, to hear your perspective on how you see the soil protection strategy interacting with CAP. And you know, there's been a few comments now also in the chat. One comment saying, as long as farmers are obtaining subsidies based on hectares and yield, nothing will change. Do we have the power to change this policy? So this is really getting to the fundamental heart of the debate about how the whole subsidy regime and direct aid is really allocated, on what basis and on what criteria, and with what binding kind of regulations to monitor and measure that. I don't know if you want to sort of pick up on that. There's a question here to Willem, which Alice Martin-Prevel has posted, which is a bit about, she wants to know a little bit more about the data and index that you use to measure this inequality of land distribution in the various EU regions. Could this index be used to orient policy in your view? What other data could be relevant to use for policy making? Yeah, so again, a kind of question about metrics and data that is informing some of the trends that you're monitoring. And perhaps for Attila, this question could be quite interesting for you, because I think it is a very central issue, from Irina Veliku. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. She really wants to hear a bit more about this kind of labor dimension in the debate. And we talked a lot about, you know, also in the vision of sort of land stewardship, caretaking of land, you know, the issue of who works the land, who are the workers on the land, and who are the active farmers in that sense, would also be, a very, very important issue to pick up on. So perhaps we can have a discussion around that. I do hear that unfortunately, it seems that Bavo has disconnected at this stage, so we'll try and get him reconnected. So while we're kind of working on that, perhaps Willem and Attila, you want to respond to that? And Clara, you can come back in perhaps to circle back on the issue of CAP, because there's definitely a lot more to get into there. Yeah.
Yes, I want to also reflect first on this remark by Eugen Popescu on the cap. It is indeed a very much impact on the land markets also, because in many regions, in most regions even, the decoupled payments, what you get per hectare is higher than the rent. So if you are owner of land, why rent it out to someone if you get already more from the cap, and you lose that if you rent it to someone else? So it has a very large impact on the land market, but it's also that you don't actually have to farm there, but you have to keep it in a decent agricultural shape. And here I think if you just get it a little bit stronger, decent agricultural shape includes quality of the soil and not doing practices which makes it soil quality less. If you just change the criteria a little, you may put an end towards, say, the large mechanization, the way that the soil protection. So this way will be tiny, small definitionary change may have large impact if you do it properly. So that is something which may have an impact. It still has the impact on the market, but you may have the soil quality, you may enter that keeping it. And now you just have to mow it twice a year or so. But if you make it clear that you have to make this quality good, it may happen. The other question by Elise about the technical way we've done so, I just followed a method which Sylvia has already used in her and her colleagues in a report on land grabbing. It's may you make a Gini index, and so you made it on the scale of the EU, and I did it on the scale of NUTS 2 levels, because then you see that part of the difference between the EU is difference between regions, and that is sometimes very logically. I mean, in Madeira you have smaller farms than in north of Europe, and that has nothing to do with an equal of societal, but an equal agricultural context. But also within regions there are very large differences, and those are especially in certain remote and rural regions. And especially if the say what we call the quality of government is less, it's very high, even higher than the EU average, and not the EU average as what the average region has, because the difference is still large. But as the EU average taken into account is different between regions. So they're largely, this does not help you very much. I mean, this data in providing what to do. I mean, you can measure it, you can see it. And you can see this is unequal, and you can monitor it based on, because this data is there for every year. You can see that certain, or every few years, not every year, but you can see that the difference is, and that you can see that certain regions become more unequal and others are not, and you can indicate what is happening. So that it provides some insights. Also in relation to the discussion on EU investment, in the report on land markets, also a Bulgarian case study is indicated, because there's two reasons. One of them where lots of also specific investment grants has been used based on all kinds of policies to improve and modernize the area, and other region, more mountains area where it's not been used. And if you look at all criteria about soil quality, but also about employment and all kinds of regions, the area where none of this investment funds perform better, because it provides you an indication that there's modernization also based on socio-economic grounds, not only on the soil, is not always providing, because the unemployment is raising there. You get many people. I mean, in the smaller farms, the peasants, but you can also consider them entrepreneurs. I mean, they make decisions about what to do. And you see that in those regions, there are more kind of local initiatives going up by farmers having, say, I think tourist things or other small activities, more diversity, more diversification of. So you see that all the employment is doing better. So there, it's not only about soil protection, but also broader agenda can help to say this is good for development. So that is an extra point, and the data can be found in this report, which is in our website.
Thanks for them. Yeah. So perhaps then, I don't know, Attila, if you want to touch on this issue of labor and labor regimes and I know there's also quite a debate about, in peasant economies, it's very much a process of labor-driven intensification and a lot of emphasis on skills, and that's the way that you innovate, is through these kind of also social networks and peer-to-peer skill sharing kind of networks. And it's very much kind of, like I said, a sort of labor-driven intensification or labor-driven innovation, rather than necessarily a resource or capital-driven kind of innovation process. So I don't know if you want to bring in that piece and how that also then, of course, relates to the issues of land and soil management.
Sure. I would like to bring two perspectives on the table. One that I was mentioning, and that for us peasants, land is about stewardship. So it's about taking care of land, and it's about working the land in harmony and in autonomy. And that does connect with labor, because when we exert labor on land on our terms, we innovate, we observe. This also strongly links to the concept of peasant agroecology I was mentioning in its three dimensions. So we practice peasant agroecology, but we also do grassroots science and innovation in agroecology, and also engage in a social political movement on agroecology. And this all requires to have our own autonomy and self-organization. When peasants are forced to engage into this kind of wage and seasonal labor intensification that in many places of the world and Europe is still happening, it indeed, as I was seeing in the quote, it's much more of a neo-colonial approach. And it's an approach especially where in Eastern Europe the World Bank was proposing for creating well-being in the countryside. The World Bank was investing a lot of money in Romania, for instance, in order to create land concentration and large land intensification and large farms, and to get rural people, many of them peasants, to engage as wage laborers into those farms. And what that created is a huge dependent situation, where we even have reports from independent journalists of very, let's say, slave labory dependent situations, where Romanian rural people received a loaf of bread a day for a day of work on a big industrial farm, nothing else but a loaf of bread a day. Is it not very problematic, at least to say, link between industrial farming and labor? So I do agree with what Irina Velicu is highlighting here, that indeed labor is also a problem when it comes to and how we put on the table labor, but mostly also labor autonomy. It's a very important topic, because again, I reiterate, and maybe because I see also that Irina Velicu is addressing this question towards Willem too, I will let him also maybe speak. But from our side, it's a lot has to do with the principles of food sovereignty. So this when farmers are sovereign to decide on their own food system and their work regime, then we can engage more and preserve soils and do what we do best, which is peasant agroecology. So this is how I would put it. And of course, I cannot outline all the links because it was not the scope of the discussion, but it does have a strong relation to it.
Indeed, yeah. And I was reminded it's a very good study that she's referring to by Tanya Lee. I would highly recommend it, because she also, in that study, in the Journal of Peasant Studies, talks about also how investors, often have different perspectives on whether or based on their investment needs. Sometimes land is needed and the labor is not, and in which case you have kind of classical expulsions, and this is the kind of more traditional, if you will, kind of land grabbing scenario where people are expelled basically from their land. But you also have very many kind of investors where both the land and the labor is needed. And so there you have issues of where the existing labor becomes incorporated into the new investment regime. And it becomes very much then a question about who can command labor, how do you dictate the terms of labor, on what terms are people included and incorporated. And she advances this notion of adverse incorporation, where in some cases, smallholders are, yes, notionally may keep their land titles, but effectively become kind of wage laborers on their own land because they become incorporated into these kind of investment regimes and global value chains. So thank you, Irina, for highlighting that particular issue. I will, since you were interested in hearing from Willem on that, I would just yeah, if Willem, if you want to say just a few more words in response to that, feel free.
I think Attila has said it already, that large mechanization means that you replace labor for energy and capital and all kinds of, and the quality of labor becomes repetitious. You are not deciding anymore yourself what you're doing. So it is for the side of labor, quality of labor, no good thing, and also kind of environmental and also the energy use. It's not the way forward. And of course, soil, as you indicated. And you can see there are comparable studies, say by case studies by scientists in Romania, indicating that in Bulgaria, indicating that also in the region itself, the development is better at a regional level with lower unemployment. If there's regions where this modernization supported by these funds did not take place. So that is what I was indicating, and so the more diversification of the rural economy. And so that's what I was indicating.
Yeah, thank you, Willem, for rounding that out. Clara, I just do want to give you an opportunity to give a final thought, final word. I know that across these kind of 64, I don't know, innovations that you tracked, you were only able to share 2, but I don't know if you really want to give a kind of final thought when it comes to really how EU policy and EU land and soil policy can really protect some of these, or champion rather, these kind of innovations, and if there is really a sort of key thing that you think would be worth highlighting here.
Okay, so I will only mention an example of land innovation that is taking place in the northeast of Catalonia. There's a land stewardship organization working to preserve hay meadows, a really interesting habitat from the cultural and natural point of view. But that is at risk of being abandoned or intensified in the sense that in more intensive practices, and this dichotomy makes it really difficult to manage. Plus, these hay meadows are really scattered and small, have a small surface and have multiple landowners. So it is a real challenge to manage these kind of habitats from the socio-cultural point of view. So there's a specific agro-environmental measure that was approved some years ago by the Catalan government that is tailored to hay meadows. But when we look in the detail of such measure, it is evident that it is not well designed in many aspects. So in the framework of this CAP reform, we are trying to dialogue with the Catalan government to make this environmental measure more effective, both in environmental and social terms. And one of the proposals that we are highlighting, and I think it can be interesting for this webinar, is that so far this agro-environmental measure is only targeted towards livestock farmers, official ones. But the reality is that this habitat is in areas which are already being abandoned. So there's a need to do something with these farms that are not farms anymore, and that are very small and very scattered and with different landowners. So we are proposing our government to change this measure so that the potential beneficiaries are not only livestock farmers, but also associations of landowners or that have hay meadows conservation goals, or land stewardship organizations. And our idea behind this proposal is to develop collective approaches to the conservation of this kind of farmland that is being abandoned. So I think that here in Spain is not something so much developed as in other countries. I believe that in the Netherlands there was a measure based on collective approaches that was quite successful, and yeah, we are pushing at that direction and seeing what it will come out. And the idea behind this is to strengthen the link between the land innovations and the consistency of agro-environmental measures.
Excellent. Well, thanks for still highlighting that great example that you're also concretely working on. You know, I hope that also serves as inspiration to perhaps some other groups and networks that are working on this. I was also just reminded of a quote quote that appeared in The Guardian in May by the EU Agricultural Commissioner. And he basically said here that, you know, reflecting on the fact that the EU lost 4 million farms over the past decade, he said this was a mistake in the CAP. The support was too much geared to industrial farming and not enough to small and medium farms. And he goes on to really extol the virtues of small and medium farms in terms of providing food security in particular, but also the environmental benefits that that are associated with small and medium-sized holdings. So, you know, maybe there is some momentum, some opportunities to really anchor and prioritize these kind of key social, labor, and environmental measures within some of the new CAP reform processes. There's a lot more that can be said. I think, you know, we're coming to the end now of the webinar, since we only have until 12 that we allocated time for this. Unfortunately, we weren't able to connect again Mr. Peters from the European Commission, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to follow up with him, in particular by just sharing some of the key discussion points that emerged from this webinar, and also get a sense from him about the opportunities for further engagement on the Commission's roadmap and issues around soil protection that DG ENVI is championing. So I'm hoping that we can still be able to follow up on that and share the outcomes of that with people that have registered for this webinar. This webinar was recorded and so will be made available on the Ruralization website. And I believe that the links to that are also posted in the chat, as well as links to, again, the various reports that were mentioned during this webinar. So I think I will close it here, and then on behalf of the organizers, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will remain engaged on these important issues of soil protection and land stewardship. So thank you very much for joining, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Bye.